So our session today is Farmland Preservation Near Growing Urban Regions, Lessons from Oregon. Our presenter is Laura Schreiner, and we will have an introduction by John Devlin.
Okay, thanks very much, Megan. Hi, everybody. I can't see you, but I'm hoping you see me. I want to give a very brief introduction to a couple of institutions that have been instrumental in the research that Laura is going to speak about and in which I've been involved. I teach at the Rural Planning Program in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. And since 2004, the University of Guelph has been involved in ICERPS, which is short for the International Comparative Rural Policy Studies Consortium. And as the name suggests, we're interested in rural policy in a comparative context. There are a number of institutions from North America and Europe involved with a focus primarily on the OECD, rural areas in the OECD. Those universities are Guelph, Quebec, and Brandon in Canada, Oregon State, Missouri, Tuskegee, and Alaska in the United States, the Autonomous University of the State of Mexico in Mexico, Barcelona, Bologna, and Highlands and Islands in Europe. So Barcelona in Spain, Bologna in Italy, Highlands and Islands in Scotland. The ICERPS began in 2004, and our main activity has been running a summer school or a summer institute, as we call it. It takes place 1 year in North America and the next year in Europe. Over 2 weeks, it involves field trips, tours and visits, but a lot of classroom work as well. And it was this group, ICERPS, which came together and put forward a proposal which turned eventually into a funded project called the Rural Policy Learning Commons, which is the technical host for this webinar. And most of you, I think, are familiar with that. So the Rural Policy Learning Commons, it's a 7-year project. We're in about year 4 now. It works on a number of themes. There's a number of networks on rural governance, migration, natural resource development, renewable energy, and indigenous communities. And it also funds work by these networks, research and information dissemination, largely through the website of RPLC. And RPLC, as a project that was stimulated originally by ICERPS, has been funding the ICERPS Summer Institute since the RPLC started. So ICERPS was kind of the first layer, and then RPLC has come on top of that, but RPLC will probably only last until 2021, but we hope that ICERPS will go on in perpetuity. So those two institutions are important to the research that Laura did, and I want to give a couple of explanations of that link. I was first introduced to Oregon's farmland protection policies in 2010 when we had the ICERPS Summer Institute hosted by Oregon State. We spent about a week in Portland, and we spent a week and a bit in Corvallis. And when I came out of that in 2010, I was quite keen to have a student work on farmland policy in Oregon, but it took several years before one turned up who was interested. Laura attended the ICERPS Summer Institute in Alaska, which took place in 2016, and she became interested in comparative policy studies. And while she was there, she met Brent Steele, who teaches at Oregon State University, and she met with several students from OSU, and those people provided really the logistical base for her to do her research in Oregon. So when we had decided that this was something that she'd be interested to do and it seemed feasible, we then looked for funding. And one of the sources of funding, once again, was the Rural Policy Learning Commons. So Laura was successful in receiving some research support. She received research support from other sources, but RPLC was an important contributor to the research. So she went to Oregon in the winter, spring of 2017, last year, finished up her MRP in the summer, and has written up a policy brief on this, and we're hoping to go on and do some publications. But this webinar is kind of a state of her thinking on policy, farmland preservation policy in Oregon. And I've heard her speak about this once in the last few months, so I'm quite interested to hear how her thinking has evolved. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Laura.
No pressure, right?
No pressure.
Okay. All right. Thanks, John. That was a great intro and really did summarize nicely how this project came together. John didn't mention that iSERPs is a ton of fun. So if there are any first year master's students or like early years PhD students out there who are listening and interested and have the opportunity to look into it, I highly recommend it. All right, so I will dive into things here. As Megan and John mentioned, this presentation is based on my master's research, which was on farmland preservation near growing urban areas, lessons that I've picked up from Oregon in my research there. Okay, so the main question that I was looking into, coming from my home context, I'm from the Greater Golden Horseshoe region in Southern Ontario, sort of South Central Ontario, and agriculture here is facing certain challenges. And there was a policy review process happening in Ontario when I was trying to figure out exactly how to frame this project and getting interested in it. And in part, it was trying to address some of these agricultural concerns from a planning perspective. And then meanwhile, Oregon is considered a model for agricultural land use planning. So my question was really, what can Ontario learn from Oregon's experience with land use planning for agriculture? Okay, there we go. So these are the study regions. This is the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And this was the area of Oregon that I was studying, the Willamette Valley. I'm not sure where everyone's calling in from today, but if you're not familiar, there's a map. So I won't speak too much about Ontario today. This is really about Oregon, but just to give a bit of context from where I was coming from for this research. The Greater Golden Horseshoe has some of the highest quality agricultural soils in Canada, and it's a relatively favorable climate too. So it's a tremendously rich agricultural resource and a hugely diverse area for agricultural production. Over 200 different agricultural products are grown here, everything from livestock and dairy to vegetables to horticultural products. And there's some microclimates within the region that support a world famous wine industry down in the Niagara area, as well as a tender fruit industry growing peaches and cherries and that kind of thing down in the same region. So tremendously rich resource. It's also a very urban area and highly populated. We have over 9 million people in this area. 4 of Canada's 10 largest cities are in this area. And the population is growing rapidly. It's one of the fastest growing urban conglomerations in North America. So you can imagine there are a few challenges for agriculture as a result of that highly urban and rapidly growing nature. We have seen some signs of agricultural decline in the area, including loss of farmland, loss of farm services and businesses, and high rates of farmland rental, particularly in this in the inner ring area, the central area where the greatest population is. So one important concept when we're talking about planning for agriculture near growing urban areas is the Impermanence Syndrome. Basically, when farmers perceive that their land may not remain in agriculture for much longer because of a growing urban area that's nearby, they tend to start to disinvest in the farm. And this disinvestment can take the form of less labor, less maintenance and upkeep. There might not be new investments in infrastructure such as irrigation, fencing, orchards, greenhouses, anything like that. We also tend to see a shift away from livestock because there's just too much conflict between livestock and the new non-agricultural neighbors that are getting closer and closer. Excuse me. there tends to be a shift towards cash crops or field crops because they're low capital, low labor, and quick return. They're the kind of crop you can grow on a field, even if you have no idea whether you'll have access to that field next year. You could still throw in some corn or soybean or certain grains and have a return on it this year. We also tend to see that young people don't want to start farming in regions that are facing a lot of impermanence syndrome. Even active farmers might move their entire operation to get away from the conflict in the area. And as the number of farms in the area dwindles, then the farm-related businesses and services start to struggle. And farmers really rely on these businesses and services for their daily operations and need them within a reasonable proximity. So as more businesses leave, then the farmers that remain have a harder time, so they start to leave, and it's this kind of downward spiral. So when we're talking about land use planning for agriculture near urban areas that are growing, it's important to recognize that the effect of the growing urban area on agriculture in the region isn't just in the land that is lost to agriculture, to development, but also extends beyond that urban boundary into the agricultural area that remains through this impermanence syndrome. All right, so with that concept under our belts, shifting over to Oregon. So why study Oregon? As I mentioned, it's a recognized leader in land use planning in North America. They've had a relatively ambitious land use planning system in place since 1973. So in the North American context, that's a pretty long history of strong land use planning, and it lets us look for the results of what's been happening in that area. And my study region, as I mentioned, is the Willamette Valley. So I picked the Willamette Valley because, for one thing, it has excellent agricultural land. This map here is a map of the, of prime agricultural soils in Oregon State on the bottom and Washington State on the top here. And you can see that this is the Willamette Valley. So it is a really unique, very large, and very high quality soil resource. And on top of that, has a very favorable climate. It's much milder than the Greater Golden Horseshoe even. So it's a tremendous area for food production, and it's been managed by people for food production for thousands of years. And these days it, has that typical smaller scale, dense, Western agricultural style. Over 200 different agricultural products are grown in the area. And the Willamette Valley produces a lot of specialty crops that aren't really grown. They grow the most of certain specialty crops compared to any other region in the United States. Things like hazelnuts, blackberries, certain grass seeds are produced in this area. Beet seeds. I don't know if you'd ever worried about where the seeds for the beets you're eating or that are being turned into sugar are coming from, but it's probably the Willamette Valley. On top of this agricultural resource, though, we also have a dense population that is growing. Oregon is rather a small state population-wise, but 3/4 of the people live in the Willamette Valley. So that's just shy of 3 million people are living in this area. And for the purposes of my research, this is a map of Oregon. For data gathering, I approximated the Willamette Valley as these 9 counties. It's ringed in by mountains on 3 sides and then the river on the north here. So in looking for lessons for Ontario or other regions in Oregon's experience, I was basically investigating 2 things. First, how is the agricultural system doing in Oregon? And secondly, how has Oregon's policy contributed to today's outcomes for agriculture? And the framework I used to evaluate how agriculture is doing in Oregon is the framework of agricultural systems. So to back it up a step, from a planning perspective, historically, if we were concerned about agriculture in an area and thinking that maybe we needed to use planning policy to support it, we'd probably historically say, okay, let's fence off the best soils. We'll just protect classes 1, 2, and 3, and we won't allow development on them because that's too valuable a resource to turn into an urban area. It turns out that's a little bit simplistic, and because agriculture isn't just soil, of course, it depends on a whole network of resources and people and businesses and environmental factors and everything working together for a viable agricultural system. So there's a growing recognition that if we want to use planning policy to support agriculture, if we've decided that's important, we need to take a more of a systems lens, an agricultural systems lens to that policy work than just looking at soil classes. And this has been kind of an evolving thought over the last, let's say, decade or so. It's been evolving for longer, but it's growing in recognition these days. So this was the definition that I used for agricultural system for my research. We've got the agricultural land base in green on the bottom, which is made up of the agricultural land itself, and then supportive land that provides important environmental services. And then there's the agribusiness group. So we have farm businesses and farm families, input and support services, first level processing, and wholesale or direct to consumer marketing and delivery. So basically everything that's within one economic link of the farm business itself. And then of course public infrastructure that supports these other components of the ag system. So as I went to evaluate how is the Willamette Valley's ag system doing, I picked some indicators. These were the 5 components of the ag system that I looked at, and I came up with indicators for each of them. And of course, it turns out that it's much easier to get data on agricultural land than on any of these other things. So I'm going to speak mostly to the agricultural land indicator just now, but I do have a few like more anecdotal or indicative or suggestive indicators from these other ones as well. So this is a chart showing the acres of lands in farms in the Willamette Valley over time. And you can see that before the land use laws were passed, we have a very different trend as far as acres and farmland as after the land use laws were fully implemented over here. There's a little gap in the graph because the census, this is census data, ag census data, and the census definition of a farm changed from this year to this year. Nevertheless, we can see that before the land use laws were passed, there's pretty sharp decline happening in the number of acres that are in farming. And since they were fully implemented in 1986, it's bouncing around a little. We have a slight net decline, but overall it's much more stable than it was before. So that would suggest that the land use planning system is likely contributing to protecting farmland from development in the Willamette Valley. The good news is that there are other far more qualified people with more time and possibly more grad students on their hands to look into this issue than just me. So I did a lit review because this is a fairly crude, I don't want to say crude, but it's a sort of a basic indicator the way I've done it with census data. Other analyses using much more robust methods have been used to look for this exact question: is the policy working to protect farmland in Oregon? Everything from aerial photography analysis to modeling to a whole bunch of other techniques. And generally the consensus in the literature is that yes, the policies are working to protect farmland in Oregon from development. So that's a good news story. I mentioned a few other indicators of success of the ag system. So there's 2 things I want to say about this picture. The first is that agriculture is still a booming industry in Oregon and in the Willamette Valley. I mentioned a few stats about it earlier, but 80% of Oregonian agricultural product is exported. Half goes out of state and half goes internationally. I have actually found frozen berries in a little grocery store in downtown Guelph here that were grown a couple of kilometers from where I was staying in Corvallis in last year. So you can find this stuff everywhere. So it is a booming and vital industry in that sense. The second thing about this image is I don't know exactly where it was taken, but it is from the Willamette Valley. And this is pretty much what it looks like within an easy hour's drive of downtown Portland. So, and actually even less, if you start in downtown Portland and you don't hit too much traffic, so you really got to pick the time of day, but the transition from urban to suburban to suddenly you're just in the middle of a vital agricultural area seems to happen much quicker in Portland than it does with cities of a similar size in other places in the United States or Canada where there hasn't been as strict land use planning. You know that feeling when it just feels like you're driving through suburbs and box stores for like hours and days before you get to anything that feels like a functioning agricultural region? Very different feeling when you're driving around the Willamette Valley. That transition happens very quickly. Another success story that Oregonians like to talk about, some of them, is the wine industry. So Oregon is famous for its Pinot Noirs especially, but it has a fantastic wine industry, and the biggest area for wine is the Dundee Hills, which is right where this arrow is pointing, between Portland and Salem. Oregon's wine industry is pretty young. It was just getting started in the 60s and 70s when the land use planning system was being developed. And the Dundee Hills area that's now hugely famous for its wines was in agriculture at the time, but it was primed for development into rural estate residential. So 5-acre lots, 10-acre lots with one big nice house each, and maybe one family enjoying that lot, but not being a productive area for agriculture. It was a whole bunch of factors, not least of which is proximity to to Portland and to Salem, meant that that area was quite likely going to just get turned into rural residential. The land use planning system basically was created just in time to prevent that. This land was protected because it was recognized as a valuable resource for wine production. And I had a couple different interviewees tell me point blank that Oregon wouldn't have a wine industry today if it weren't for the land use planning program. You can tell a similar story about the Hood River Valley. So this isn't actually in the Willamette Valleys over here, but this is the Hood River Valley, and it is an orchard region. And it was an orchard region when the land use planning system was created. It was also primed for rural estate residential development because this is Mount Hood right here, which is in the background in this picture, which has some awesome ski areas, I'm told. And you can see how close it is to Portland. So with the combined pressure of Portland and this recreational ski area, you can imagine the pressure to just keep building nice ski chalets or, weekend places in this gorgeous valley that's full of orchards, which would have eventually probably undercut the agriculture happening in the area. However, the land use planning system, again, was created just in time that today very little orchard acreage has been lost at all. Some, but not very much. And its pears are still a major Oregonian export, and a lot of them come from this region. And one final story about agriculture in Portland, or in Oregon, I should say. This is a photo of the Portland Farmers Market. Oregon has more farmers markets per capita than many other places in North America. I haven't found one yet that's higher, but I haven't done a totally thorough review of the whole continent. And there's a really strong kind of farm-to-table restaurant scene in Portland, Oregon, and especially in Portland. There's a strong identity around local food here that was very effectively spoofed in Portlandia, if you've ever seen it. I had a couple Oregonians tell me that Portlandia is pretty much a documentary. So the question is, if we have these indicators of success for the ag system, how has Oregon done it? Well, the land use planning system was created in 1973. It's a statewide system and it's mandatory, but it's implemented by local levels of government. Some of the key features of Oregon's planning system are minimum agricultural lot sizes. In the Willamette Valley, it's typically 80 acres as a minimum lot size. Special zoning for the highest value farmland with restrictions on land use there. So restrictions on things like new dwellings or the types of businesses that are allowed to locate on that land. And then associated property tax benefits, especially for those highest value farmland. And another key component that Oregon's quite famous for are the urban growth boundaries. Each city in Oregon is required to have its own urban growth boundary that is designed. And it really is a strong demarcation. Urban land uses go inside the boundary and rural land uses go outside the boundary. I'm going to come back to that later, but basically I pulled out 6 lessons from my research that Ontario and other regions that have this combination of ag land and rapid growth could possibly take away from Oregon's experience. So the first is that firmer, rational urban growth boundaries create greater land use certainty. This is just from Google Maps, and it's a shot of Salem. This is downtown Salem here. Salem's the capital of Oregon. And this is all active agricultural land. So we've got the suburbs and the city, and then this rapid transition to a very active agricultural area. I mentioned before that that transition feels like it happens quicker in Oregon than in some places. And I think these urban growth boundaries, they help to create a sense of landscape permanence in the agricultural area that help to provide enough certainty for farmers and farm businesses to invest in their operation and keep agriculture vital in that area. So it really does help to address that issue of impermanence syndrome that I talked about before. Lesson 2 is that an agricultural systems-based approach to planning is possible, and it does require resources. So this could be an entire master's thesis in itself, but I'm going to give you a very Coles Notes version. This is a map of Metro Portland, the biggest city, and historically, when land was brought inside the urban growth boundaries, it was brought in on a strict hierarchy based on soils. So the best quality soils were brought in last, and lower quality soils were required to be brought into the urban growth boundary first. For a whole bunch of reasons, that was found to be problematic, and the metro area was really running into those problems. So they came up with a new system in the early 2000s, where the land that is brought into the urban growth boundary is brought in on a much more complex methodology. And this methodology, among other things, really does consider all the aspects of that ag system definition that I had up before with that chart showing the resource flows. So it is a much more ag systems based approach to deciding which land is appropriate for urban development as needed, and which land would be better. It's too valuable as farmland. We should keep it as farmland for the appreciable future. To do this, the yellow areas on this map show the urban growth boundary. So that's to accommodate 20 years of growth. And then they said, okay, we're going to do this complex analysis, and then we're going to decide that these blue areas are going to be called the urban reserves. So once we've used up the whole urban growth boundary area, then we can start using the urban reserves. That'll be next to bring into the urban growth boundary. So we've already identified it and sort of sacrificed it for eventual urban development. But on the flip side, we're going to identify rural reserves. So the green area on the map was identified as really important agricultural land based on the whole agricultural system, and was therefore protected as rural reserves, which are not allowed to be brought into the urban growth boundary for the next 50 years. So they put a longer planning horizon on this region that was experiencing a lot of these problems. This is a new system, so we can't really evaluate how it's doing, but it's definitely worth following what happens in this metro area. The other lesson here is that it does require significant resources to do this level of analysis. A significant chunk of staff time was contributed by the State Department of Agriculture, the Metro Portland Government and Planning Department, the Soil and Water Conservation Authorities, and a bunch of other groups. So it took a lot of on the ground and data work to do the analysis that went into this. And I think that if a region is serious about protecting the agricultural system, that's probably the kind of investment that's required. All right, lesson 3, citizen engagement and support is critical. So I've heard that people say that the Oregonian system of protecting farmland is inherently politically susceptible because it's basically all based on zoning. And since zoning is based on policy, and policy can be changed by government, zoning is kind of only as strong as the public support that it has. Oregon has enjoyed relatively high public support for its land use planning system, especially in the early days when it was created in the 1970s. Significant investments were made by government to consult with citizens and organizations across the entire state to build consensus around the land use planning program and build support for it. It was quite effective. Certain compromises were made in that process, but it was quite effective. And in fact, I was a bit surprised to find out that some of the earliest proponents and drivers behind the land use planning system in Oregon were Republicans and dairy farmers in the Willamette Valley, which are not two groups that I typically associate these days with being massive supporters of land use planning policy and land use restrictions. But it was a different time, and it was a very bipartisan process, the development of the system, but those were two of the biggest early leaders. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. Of course, there have always been opponents to the land use planning system, and there have been various challenges launched at it over its history. The most famous of these happened in the early 2000s when a series of ballot measures nearly undid Oregon's land use planning program. This is a really complex story, and I'm going to give a very shortened version of it. So basically, ballot measure 37 was passed. It's kind of a public vote that almost undid the land use planning system, especially for the type of high value farmland in the Willamette Valley, and for those near urban areas. So to massively oversimplify it, Measure 37 passed because the anti-land use planning campaign had a very effective advertising strategy that targeted citizen frustrations with certain aspects of the certain land use planning issues. It was pitched as a campaign to support the little guy, quote unquote, individual longtime landowners who felt that their property values or property rights had been interfered with by the land use planning system. And so Measure 37 was pitched as a way to correct that hardship for those individual landowners. After it passed, the public soured on Measure 37 rather quickly because it became clear that the main benefactors of this change were not individual landowners, but rather large-scale landowners wanting to build entire subdivisions, malls, open pit mines, that sort of thing on prime farmland. And then concurrently, the pro-planning side also launched a major public education campaign and their own ad campaign. And so all of this led to, a few years later, Measure 49 was put to the public, which basically corrected all of the things that have been undone by Measure 37, and it passed by an even higher margin of public support. That's vastly oversimplified. 49 didn't fix everything, but the whole experience really does highlight the critical importance of public support for the system, especially in a place like Oregon where ballot measures are a possibility and anybody from the public can put those sorts of things on election ballots, but that's a whole other thing. But I think that the question of citizen engagement and support is really critical in any jurisdiction, although it does look a little different in different jurisdictions. Lesson 4, a watchdog is important. So this was something that I thought was fascinating when I was studying Oregon. There's an organization there called 1000 Friends of Oregon that was started in the very early days of the land use planning system because government folks and non-government folks recognized that there needed to be a watchdog in place to make sure that these crazy new laws actually worked and were used by all the local governments that were supposed to be enforcing them and implementing them. So 1000 Friends of Oregon was created. Their tagline here is working with Oregonians to enhance our quality of life by building livable urban and rural communities, protecting family farms and forests, and conserving natural areas. And in their early days, they were basically a small group of lawyers that helped implement the land use planning system by going around and suing counties and cities that didn't comply with the new mandatory state laws, taking them to court. And they had a tremendously high success rate in winning these cases because apparently they only really tackled the easy ones because it was just so blatant that there were these new laws and the local governments either didn't understand them or didn't want to use them. And if you took them to court, it was very cut and dry who should win, because they were mandatory rules. Thousand Friends of Oregon also runs a major side of their work is education, both public education, and they, even in the early days, they went around and presented to city councils, county councils, explaining the new land use system and how it worked and how these laws worked. So that's always been a big part of what they do. And I think these days that's probably the major part of what they do, is a lot of that public education. And they do some really valuable research on land use planning issues, both urban and rural, because both sides of that coin are very important. I asked several people that I interviewed what role they thought this organization had played, and a few people told me they didn't even think that the land use planning system would be still existent in Oregon today if Thousand Friends of Oregon hadn't been playing the important role that they have been over the years. This was particularly interesting to me because we don't have anything remotely like this in Ontario, and it does get at that question of, how do you implement policy? How do you enforce policy? Once you come up with a good idea and you get it written out, what happens after that? So I thought this is totally worthy of its own whole study on its own, I think. Lesson 5, strong rural planning and strong urban planning are mutually dependent. My focus for this research was entirely rural and specifically agricultural. Forest land is another major part of Oregon that's a major part of the land use planning system, but my focus was always the agricultural part. But I couldn't get away from the fact that even though I wasn't looking for it, that good urban planning in Oregon has been just as important. And I have this quote from one of my interviewees that I'm going to read because he just said it really well. The land use planning system is not just about protecting farmland, or it's not just about effective urban growth, or it's not just about delivery of services in an efficient way. It's about all of those things working together. I've always said that the exclusive farm use zone, that's the special zone for high quality farmland, is only as good as effective urban planning is. Because if you waste your land inside the urban growth boundary, then there's just going to be pressure to expand that urban growth boundary. On the other hand, if you do great urban planning, but you don't have farmland protection or good rural planning, where people can just leapfrog out there and develop, then you're going to start to waste land in the urban growth boundary and have a push out, which costs cities more for providing infrastructure and the like. City of Portland's downtown is one of the most viable I've ever been in for a city of that size. It's because people want to be there because there aren't clusters outside the edges that are taking away from that. So that's all one quote, but I just thought he said it really well. I can't speak to this because it wasn't the focus of my research, but I can speak to the importance of it. And finally, last lesson, land use planning alone is not enough, unfortunately, because then I'd have all the answers. Land use, I've come across this idea both in Ontario and in Oregon that if farmers can't make a living farming, then well-protected farmland is useless. It doesn't do anyone any good. It just sits there. And furthermore, if farmers can't make a viable living farming, then there, of course, no matter how good your policies are, there is going to be tremendous pressure for them to sell to developers to get some return out of that land in any way they can. So policy, and especially land use policy alone, can't make farming lucrative, but it can help. And it's important to understand that full ag system context in which farmers exist and in which farming happens. I think if a region is concerned about agriculture, especially near growing urban areas, and they've decided that they want to support agriculture, then land use planning is a really important tool, and it can't be the only tool that's used. So some other examples of tools that have been used by Oregon to support agriculture include agricultural extension services, which are massively available, like way more than what I've seen around Ontario. So those extension services help out farmers at every different scale. Public infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure in Oregon, especially in the Willamette Valley, with the highway system connecting up to the Port of Portland, which allows for international export, is really critical to the type of farming that happens in the area. Soil and water conservation authorities are also important in Oregon. So those are just a few examples, but it's important to keep this in mind when you're looking at the ag system and these sorts of issues. So, in conclusion, I know I've painted this kind of rosy picture, and I want to be clear that Oregon's system isn't perfect. It certainly has its problems and its critiques. As I mentioned, it's politically susceptible, as most land use planning systems are. Oregon does not have strong regional planning. The Willamette Valley is made up of 9 counties, and I forget how many different cities within those counties, and each does its own land use planning, except for Metro Portland. So we have these urban growth boundaries around each of the cities that are kind of expanding towards each other, and there isn't necessarily great regional coordination. So that's something that other jurisdictions have done really well and maybe hasn't happened the best in Oregon. And ultimately, even in the Metro Portland area where they're starting to look at these urban and rural reserves, the whole system is still based on a concept of expanding boxes. And ultimately, farmland is really viewed as, eventually we could develop it. Eventually it could become an urban use if we need it to become an urban use. Eventually it's there for us if we need it. At no point in Oregon's system does anyone ever sit down and say, this region here is just too important as farmland or as forest land to be anything else, and we need to fence it off forever. That doesn't happen in Oregon's system. So that some people identify that as a weakness. Nevertheless, by North American standards, Oregon has been quite successful both in protecting agricultural land from development, as has been fairly extensively researched, and in supporting farming and the whole agricultural system, which I would say has not been very extensively researched, at least within the kind of planning context that I was talking about here. So lots of opportunity there. And I think that Oregon's experience really does hold some key lessons for Ontario as we try to improve our planning for agricultural systems and for a lot of other regions across North America as well. And if there's any students out there listening, there's also lots of potential here for future comparative research. All right, thank you. I'm sure I've rambled long enough, but I would love to take any questions if there are any, and I don't know how to do that. Oh. Hi, Megan.
Hi, thank you, Laura. That was a great presentation. Very informative and interesting. Okay, so now that concludes the presentation. We will go into a little over 15 minutes we have for questions. I do have one question to start off with. So the first question is, understanding that policy can't be translated directly between different places due to differences in context, do you think there are factors unique to Oregon that have helped to make the planning program successful there?
Yes. And that's a very good question. Yeah, I think one of the really important things, so to be clear, I didn't do a full-blown comparison because it just was out of scope for my major paper for this master's, but I didn't do a full-blown comparison between Oregon and Ontario, but I did obviously do a lot of that kind of in my head as I was going along. And I think a major difference that popped up for me is that agriculture is really a very strong part of the Oregonian identity, much more so than in Ontario, even though I would argue it is a strong thing in Ontario. But in the Greater Golden Horseshoe region of Ontario, we have 9 million plus people. We have Bay Street and the financial sector. We have, or had, or something, an automotive sector. We have a nuclear facility. We have like a whole bunch of different economic sectors going on. The Willamette Valley, Oregon is a small state relative to the rest of the country. It doesn't have a major financial sector. It doesn't have major manufacturing. So agriculture and forestry are relatively larger components of the economy there. And therefore they register larger, I would say, in the public consciousness and the kind of Oregonian identity. There's this really strong creation myth around Oregon. Actually, I think I have it. Hang on. Did I put it in here? Yes. Okay. This is a photo I took of the Oregon State Capitol, and this guy who's like made of gold or whatever at the top of the Oregon State Capitol, he's like the lumberjack who was one of the founders of Oregon. And when you go inside the state capitol, there's murals on all the walls of forestry and then of agriculture. And so I think agriculture being that much more in the public's mind does help to keep it a policy priority. And it being a relatively larger sector of the economy does help to keep it a policy priority and in the public's mind. And I think that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I think that the public support for this sort of policy is really critical. And one thing I'm thinking about a lot lately is how do we develop that in a place like the Greater Golden Horseshoe region of Ontario, where there's so many different competing priorities and industries and all of those things. So I don't have the answers there, but I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I don't think it's a reason to assume that what's been done in Oregon can't be done elsewhere.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question is from Rod Frank, and he asks, how do you find common ground between agrarians, environmentalists, and developers without it turning into a political sideshow?
Oh my God, I wish I knew. Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. I think practitioners who've been doing this work for longer might be a little better. But looking at the history of what's happened in Oregon, I think that the early days of the planning system being created, like in the early 1970s, and even back into the kind of mid 60s when it all started, there was some really fascinating bipartisan and multi-sectoral collaboration at that time to come together and create these policies that, from today's polarized standpoint, are almost surprising. And right now, then you just start spiraling off to talk about like Facebook and the effect of social media on the polarization of society, which is why I'm having trouble answering this question. But I think whoever can figure that out is going to do a lot of good in the world. I think one thing that helped Oregon in the early days was identifying a common enemy, and I don't know that that's a great way to do things. But California had taken up a ton of its rural agricultural land with this, ranchettes and rural estate properties and whatever. And so those bumper stickers that I showed earlier that said "Don't Californicate Oregon" were part of the campaign to say Oregonians kind of had the chance to look down at what happened in California and go, whoa, like maybe that's not what we want Oregon to look like. And they were able to unify around that idea. I don't know that identifying a common enemy is a great way to build bridges, but I think it did help a little bit in Oregon's history.
Great, all right, thank you. Our next question is from Paul Kraling. In examining the ag area uses of land, is there evidence of pressures for ag commodity crops associated with biofuels and biosynthetic commodities?
Geez, Paul, you could have sent me that one yesterday. I don't think I have good enough data to answer that. I know that issue was mentioned, but it's not something that I focused on in the course of my research, so I wouldn't be comfortable speaking to it, unfortunately. I think it's a good question, though.
Okay. Yep, thanks. You mentioned at the end how you talked mostly about the positive sides of Oregon's planning system. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more to like the biggest flaws in their planning system.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think sometimes I forget to get into this in that last slide, but I think I actually did remember this time to talk about the fact that and one of the folks that I interviewed was really good for clarifying this for me. But he said, like, at no point under Oregon's system does anybody ever say, okay, this land, its highest and best use is agriculture and it should be protected as such, or highest and best used is forestry and should be protected as such. In some sense, even though there are all these rules and regulations and processes in place, in some sense it's still built on the same paradigm that like basically all of North America operates on, where rural land is just land in waiting for development. Granted, on a much slower process, and like Oregon's doing better than most areas, but it's still within that same paradigm. So I think that is a concern that some people have. Another concern, I don't know if this is exactly a weakness, but on that question of public engagement and support, some of the people that I interviewed talked about, they were concerned, some of them, that public engagement and support was waning for a few reasons. And one of them was simply the fact that the system was created in the early 70s. The people who built up the land use planning system to what it is today, who really understood the need for it, have aged out and are retiring. And it's a whole new, crowd of people coming in and coming into politics, coming into bureaucracy, who don't necessarily understand on a core level, and they're concerned that maybe we haven't done the best education for these coming generations. And another major thing is there's a lot of immigration to Oregon from other states as well as internationally, and even if you're coming from basically anywhere else in the United States and moving to Oregon, you might not at all understand how the planning system works because it's relatively unique. So how do we educate newcomers to Oregon about the fact that, you know, these frustrations you're having with not being able to build whatever it is you want on your rural property or whatever it is, like, those are because we have these structures in place that are keeping the landscape looking like, you know, the reason you moved here in the first place. How do you educate newcomers? And that really rang for me because the Greater Golden Horseshoe region has such a tremendous amount of immigration from all over Canada and all over the world. If this is a policy priority, or if we think it should be, how do you connect with newcomers to an area where the population is growing and changing in demographics so quickly that we don't have the same kind of origin story in agriculture that might have existed here 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So that it's not necessarily a weakness of the system, but some folks I interviewed thought that it was maybe a weakness of the proponents of the system, that they weren't educating people as effectively as they could, and they were concerned that the system was being eroded over time because of that. I don't think it's falling apart exactly, but it's something that's come up.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Anna Friedis, and she's curious about your perspective on agriculture as a key piece of Oregon's identity and creation myth. Was there a strong historical or nostalgic tendency among interviewees, or are people more focused on how we're doing things now and in the future?
Oh, that's a good question. By and large, the people that I spoke with were much more focused on what's happening now and what's happening into the future. It wasn't like a romanticized, wouldn't it be great if we were all still dairy farming in the Willamette Valley, which was a major component of farming in the valley that has waned because dairy farms tend to smell a little bit, and now there's a lot more people living there, so they've gone elsewhere. Yeah, no, it was much more present day and forward thinking. I guess I spoke to that creation myth thing and the history of agriculture in the area because it leapt out at me that it seemed to me, granted, I was there to interview people about agriculture, but it still seemed to me that there was a stronger awareness of agriculture amongst Oregonians kind of across the board in the Willamette Valley specifically than I think I experience in the Greater Golden Horseshoe region, where some people live a totally urban life all the time because there's so much more urban and there's so much of a larger population here. And so and when I went to the state legislature and the state capitol, walked into the building, and there were these like huge mosaic murals all over the wall about the history of agriculture in the region. I thought, I'm pretty sure we don't have that at Queen's Park in Toronto. You know, I think it looms larger in the public consciousness. But when I was speaking to people about land use planning issues and agricultural issues and all of this stuff, it was very much rooted in what's happening today and what's happening looking forward. Yeah.
Great. Our next question is from John. How important is the local food movement to the continuing success of the farmland protection policy?
I think it's been quite important. This is based on impressions. It wasn't something I was specifically, reading about, but based on my impressions, I would say it's been quite important. For one thing, the local food movement is one way that an urban population engages with agriculture. And so as people move to Portland, because it's a super cool city to live in, the farmers markets are massive and really cool. And so that's a way that they can, and highly regulated, like you can only sell stuff at those farmers markets if it is grown by you in Oregon, like very strict. So I think the local food movement, for one thing, it can help to build markets for local farmers. And for another thing, it can help to engage the public, the broader public, and possibly the urban public with these sorts of issues. And that can help to build that public support, and that can filter into policy. So it's sort of, a series of cascading effects in that sense. 80% of Oregon's agricultural product is exported. So it's a major industry. This isn't just, a lot of small, like market farm kind of things. But I think in Oregon, it's partly the public consciousness. The other fun thing about the Willamette Valley is you can access local greens and local produce all winter long. They don't have nearly the harsh winters that we have here. So that definitely helps them build that local food scene and the associated awareness for agriculture. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have one more question, and it will be our last one as we're coming up to the end of the hour. It's from Heather Unger. Do you have some examples of some successful marketing or education campaigns?
I guess it depends. Yes. Let me think. It depends what kind of education campaigns you're talking about. The story of those ballot measures that happened in the 2000s, ballot measure 37 and then ballot measure 49, they were both successful, even though one was no and one was yes, basically. So those were, I would say, quite successful public engagement and marketing campaigns in their own right. I think that also, I don't know if you're like looking for case studies or anything. I don't have any nice succinct stories that I can tell on this, unfortunately, but the group 1000 Friends of Oregon also does a lot of this sort of marketing and public education on all kinds of land use planning issues. So not just agricultural, they do a lot of urban issues too. But they've got some really interesting marketing stories under their belts these days. So I follow them on social media now, and these days they've been doing a lot about secondary dwelling units on urban properties in Portland. Portland housing prices are going up dramatically, so they're trying to allow for more densification of existing suburbs. And Thousand Friends has been doing some really interesting public education around that issue, because that tends to be really hot button, and people often go like strongly one way or another and kind of disregard all the facts when they get into those sorts of issues. And Thousand Friends has done some interesting work around trying to have a more nuanced conversation around that subject. So not explicitly rural, but it does relate to rural, because it's Portland's going to keep growing, and we're going to have to keep densifying Portland if we want to protect the agricultural areas that are just outside it.
Okay, great. And that concludes our webinar. So I'd like to thank you again, Laura, for your presentation, as well as I'd like to thank the audience for their great questions and participation.